All right, today, lesson 2C, angle relationships. In our last lesson, our focus was on defining some geometric ideas in addition to practicing drawing and measuring both segments and angles. And as we continue through this geometry stuff, the part about geometry at the very beginning is there are lots of vocab terms or lots of defining things, and so that's kind of how we have to start today as well. And that's our discussion basically of angle relationships. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Some background knowledge. Here are some things that we talked about. We defined what an angle was and how an angle is made up of a vertex, which is a point, which is the corner of the angle, if you want to think of it that way. And all angles are made up of two sides, which are rays. So in this case, ray AB and ray AC. And we can name this angle several different ways. One would be angle BAC. Another way would be going in the reverse of that, angle CAB. If we're going to name the angle that way, we have to make sure the vertex is in the middle. We could also name that angle A because there is only one angle A there. And if we have a number in the vertex there, we could also name it, in this case, as angle 5. The new stuff starting today would be adjacent angles. So an adjacent angle, adjacent in English means, and this is where we start filling things in, means next to. So in this picture, we have two angles that are right next to each other. And what that leads us to is the fact that there really are three angles in this picture. One angle is this angle right here, which is angle WXY. Now we could, of course, reverse the letters, and that would be okay. Angle YXW. So in other words, either direction, this direction or this direction. So we're talking about that angle right there right now. Another angle in this picture is that one, which would be angle YXZ, or the reverse of that, angle ZXY. And what's the third angle that's in that picture? Anybody have any idea? Yeah, it's the big angle that the two are made up of. So that big angle right there, angle WXZ, or of course we could flip the letters there. Now one of the things I brought up last time was the fact that we could name, and I already showed you that as part of the background knowledge, that we could name the angle by its vertex. But we can't name this angle by angle X, and it's because we don't know what angle we're talking about. There are three angles in this picture that all involve X as the vertex. All three of them. And so we don't really know which one we're referring to. And so in this case, we cannot call that angle X because, once again, we don't know which one we're talking about. All right, so naming two adjacent angles. Well, that angle right there, WXY, is adjacent to this one right here, YXZ. Those are the two adjacent angles in that picture. All right, continuing on. Next, complementary angles. And some of you may have heard of complementary angles before, but complementary angles are angles whose sum is 90 degrees. Angles whose sum is 90 degrees. Now, in terms of a picture, that might look something like this. So we take a 90-degree angle, and typically we know we have a 90-degree angle if we have a little square in the corner. But we have angle A and angle B. Those two are complementary because the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle B is equal to 90 degrees. So that little M out in front of the angle symbol right here, this means measure of angle A. This means measure of angle B. And so I think you have another blank area to fill in here. The measure of an angle is read as or we read that as the measure of an angle. That's just kind of a shortcut way of writing that down. Now, in our picture here, we have complementary angles that form a right angle, and they happen to be adjacent to each other. But I want to bring up something. Complementary angles don't have to be adjacent. For example, right there, angle X and angle Y, those are not adjacent, but they add up to 90 degrees. So complementary angles do not necessarily have to be adjacent to each other. I could have one in this upper corner of the room and one back there. I mean, as long as they add to 90, by definition, they are called complementary angles. All right, next, find the complement of the angle measures below. So what that means is we're trying to find the angle that goes with the one that's listed there to make complementary angles. So what angle has to go with number 1? Tell me, please. What? Let's try that again. What does it have to be? 60 degrees, because 30 and 60 make 90. That's what makes them complementary. Go ahead and do 2 through 8. So it's obvious as you were shoulder partnering, you know, number 2 is 41 degrees, and number 3 is 10 degrees, and number 4 is 28 degrees. And if you're going to do those in your head, just be careful. Number 5 is 65 degrees, 6 is 13 degrees, 7 is 37 degrees. However, what is number 8? Show me what a negative 10 degree angle looks like. Right? When you get into trigonometry, and in fact, if you look on the side board right there, I tutor a lot of high school and college students in math, and right in the middle there, you can see some trigonometry, and you can see that one right there where I went backwards 60 degrees. Do you see where the negative 60 is? So when you get into trigonometry, there are ways of dealing with negative angles. But what we find out is that a negative 60 degree angle is really a 300 degree angle. So in terms of what we're talking about right here, though, there's no way to represent that. Because if you say negative 10 degrees, that's really a positive 350 degree angle. And positive 350 and 100, guess what? That doesn't make 90. Okay, so in a situation like this, it has no complement. All right, so complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. And for now, angles can't be negative. That's basically what I was trying to say earlier. Supplementary angles. Supplementary angles are angles that have a sum of 180 degrees. And let me tell you the way that I always remember the difference between the two. 90 is smaller than 180. Complementary, the first letter of that is C. Supplementary, the first letter of that is S. If you think about alphabetical order, the one that comes before in the alphabet is the smaller of those two. You can remember this any way that you want to, but complementary angles have a sum of 90. Supplementary angles have a sum of 180. And supplementary angles could be adjacent, but they don't have to be. In this picture, the measure of angle K and the measure of angle T are supplementary to each other. And there's actually a name for them when they are adjacent to each other. And they are called a linear pair. And so a linear pair is when we have two adjacent angles on a line that are supplementary, much like what we see in that picture right there. So when I refer to linear pair, I'm talking about supplementary angles that are adjacent on a line. But supplementary angles, like complementary, they don't have to be adjacent to each other to be supplementary. However, B and C, while they add to 180, they don't form a linear pair because they're not sitting adjacent on a line. Okay? So make sure you understand the difference between those two ideas. All right, you go ahead and do 1 through 8 with the supplementary problems. So the only issue really should have been in the last one. Maybe I know what the name of this building is. Yeah, and it really does lean like that, by the way. So if I tell you, and these are accurate measurements as of today, it's leaning one direction 95.5. What's the degree that it's leaning to the right? What would that be? A little tougher to do on our head, right? Got it? 104.5. Well, that would mean that those two angles add up to 200. 84.5. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the only tough one here should have been the last one, and it should not have been tough. Supplementary angles add up to 180, so we're trying to find the angle that goes with that to make a sum of 180. And so in number 8, I walked around and I looked, and a lot of you figured this one out. You've got to find the complement of 50 first, and then find the supplement of that. Well, the complement of 50 is, of course, 40 degrees. Now you're finding the supplement of that, and that would, of course, be 140 degrees. All right, let's go to the back side of your notes. And this is exactly why we needed the protractor. First of all, let's define what these new angles are. Vertical angles are angles that are formed by intersecting lines. Of course, we've got more blank areas to fill stuff in. Vertical angles are formed by intersecting lines. So here we have a pair of intersecting lines. Your picture in your notes looks exactly like that. So with your protractor, I would like you to measure all 4 angles. You might have to turn your paper a little bit to get a better look at what those angles are. You might have to extend your lines out a bit to get a more accurate measurement. But I would like you to measure all 4 of those angles and write them down as you're going around, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to compare those with our shoulder partner. So when you did your measuring here, you should have come up with something like this. This one was 70, this one was 110, this one was 70, and this one was 110. That's what you should have measured. And so what we're trying to see here is that the angles that are across from each other, this angle and this angle, which happen to be vertical angles, they are the same. And we call that congruent. Those two angles are congruent to each other, and that will always be the case. And going the other direction, this angle right here, the 70-degree angle, and this one are also the same, and they happen to be vertical angles. And so what that tells us is this. That tells us that vertical angles are always going to be congruent to each other. So now, right below that is the statement, opposite angles or vertical angles are always congruent. And congruent means, in geometry, equal in measure. Congruent means equal in measure. And so if we take a look at this new picture that we have there, what that means is that those two angles right there, whatever they happen to be, they're going to be the same. They are going to be the same. Okay? So if that one's 37, the opposite one to it is also 37. And also, the other two angles that are in that picture, these two right here, those are opposite angles, or in other words, they are vertical angles. And so what that means is that they have to also be congruent. So if this angle is 121 degrees, guess what? That angle right there is also 121 degrees. So in that original picture, I had you measure all 4 hoping that you would see that, and a lot of you did see that. And so what that means is, if you're given a picture like that, if you know one of the angles, you don't even need to measure anymore because you can find out what the rest of them are. Okay? So that's vertical angles. Now we also have supplementary angles in this specific picture. Remember, supplementary angles add up to 180. So watch. These two angles right here are supplementary. They're on that straight line right there. There's also supplementary angles right here. Those two angles add up to 180. They're on that another different straight line. These two angles are supplementary to each other. They add up to 180. And then also, those two right there are supplementary. They add up to 180. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get to the point where I can give you, and this is coming up in a few days, I give you a picture with about 25 angles, and I only give you one angle, and you got to be able to find all the rest of them without a protractor. Well, it's possible when you remember things like complementary, supplementary, vertical, and then we're just going to keep adding on pieces to that list. Okay? All right, so that's vertical angles. Next, we just talked about vertical angles, so now I've put a picture with some letters in there. And are there letters in your picture? Yeah, there are. Okay. First thing I want you to do is to name two pairs of vertical angles. Can somebody give me one pair? And based upon what we just talked about, that should be easy. What's one pair of vertical angles? Just tell me. What? So B and D, one pair of vertical angles, and then obviously A and C. A and C are vertical, which means they are congruent to each other. Angle B and D, that's the other pair of vertical angles. They are congruent to each other. All right, same picture. Somebody give me one pair of adjacent angles. Yes. B and C, those are adjacent. Yes. A and D, those are adjacent. D and C, good. Those are adjacent. There's one more. I've already forgotten which ones we've done. A and D, I don't remember whether, to be honest with you, I don't remember if that was the one that we had not listed yet or not, but look. A and B are adjacent. They also happen to be supplementary, and they form a linear pair, by the way. B and C, that's another pair of adjacent angles. C and D, those are adjacent. And also A and D, and I think that was the one maybe we had not listed yet. And so, all of those are adjacent, but in this specific picture, they're also supplementary, and they also form a linear pair. Now, before I have you start listing out from some pictures what specific types of angles we see, we need to make sure that you understand the huge difference between vertical angles and supplementary angles. So, for example, this is what vertical angles look like. This is what supplementary angles look like. Vertical angles are not adjacent. Supplementary angles in a picture like this are adjacent. Don't get those two ideas mixed up. Okay, last thing for today, you have 8 pictures. And in the pictures, you are supposed to list whether the relationship is complementary, a linear pair, vertical, or adjacent. So go ahead and do all 8 of those, please. So it is extremely important that we understand all of these ideas because, like I said, in a few lessons, I'm going to be giving you a picture with like 20 or 30 angles. I'll give you maybe 1 or 2, and you got to find all the rest of them without a protractor. And it is extremely important that you understand all of these things. Like number one, those two angles are vertical. And what that means is that they are also congruent to each other. So if angle A is 115 degrees, angle B is also 115. You don't need a protractor to prove that. Vertical angles are congruent. Number two, C and D are adjacent and complementary. They're adjacent because they sit next to each other, but they also happen to be complementary because they will have to add up to 90 degrees because of the fact that the angle sitting right next to them is also 90. Number three, those are only adjacent angles. Number four, those form a linear pair and they are adjacent to each other. Now, I didn't ask if any of them were supplementary. They happen to be supplementary and a linear pair, but they're also adjacent to each other. So, if I knew that angle H was 60 degrees, because I know they're supplementary or they form a linear pair, I would know automatically without a protractor that angle G is 120 degrees. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Number five, those are only adjacent. Number six, those are adjacent, but they also form a linear pair. So once again, what that tells me is that if I know that angle C is 20 degrees, I know angle D has to be 160. F would be adjacent and complementary. And then 8, those are vertical angles. So if I know that angle G is 55 degrees, guess what? So is angle H. Don't need a protractor to prove that. All right, any questions about any of the 8 problems we just did? All right, we are finished for today.